This evening we're going to hear the experience and distilled wisdom of a remarkable person. But if you'll indulge me for a moment, before I go on and formally introduce Lee Durrell, I'm just going to share a little personal reflection. It'll only be short, because this is not about me this evening. The reflection to share just briefly with you is, and it comes back to Dural, is that I wouldn't have had the life and times that I have in zoos and in conservation if, more years ago than I care to remember, 1978, so you can work it out. As a vet student, I hadn't had a work placement at Jersey Zoo. So I spent some time there, and the magic and inspiration of Dural was there, and that led me to think I want to do conservation through my working life. And so I have. I've tried to. And ever since then, in this crowded, warming, damaged world that we live in, I've been trying to recapture that spirit of Dural. So that's my thank you and a personal feeling about Dural. Anyway, it's about Lee, it's not about me. Lee is the Honorary Director of the Dural Wildlife Conservation Trust. Her first fascination was studying animal communication in the forests of Madagascar. And she had a fortuitous encounter with her hero, Gerald Dural, while studying for her PhD at Duke University. And this led to shared love, vision and future. And Lee joined Jerry on Jersey, and they were the power couple, if you like, in conservation. If you want to, just to move sideways for a moment, if you want to learn more about Jerry Dural and his unique childhood, then you should be watching the Durrells. I have been, but my memory is that it was 9 p.m. Sunday evenings on ITV. 8 numbers, difficult. Anyway, it's great, and it demonstrates, you know, what he was and how Jerry became the great person that he was. Since his death in 1995, Lee has carried on the Dural legacy and led this enduring mission to save species from extinction. She's an eminent zoologist and author, and was awarded an MBE in 2011 for services to conservation. Now, this evening, she may explain why in certain parts of the world she is referred to as Grandmother Tortoise. That'd be nice. But I know that what she definitely will do is give us renewed hope that it is possible to save species from extinction, as proven by the Dural Wildlife Conservation Trust. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're in for a treat. I present to you Lee Dural, Tribal Elder. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's a very great pleasure to be here. I shall put my stick down while I talk, and then I will hand it over to the appropriate person afterwards. But thank you very much for asking me to speak as a tribal elder at Royal Zoological Society of Scotland. I feel very humble to have been included in such a group, but I do know that I'm certainly old enough. As Chris referred to, my nickname in Madagascar was Grandmother of the Tortoise, and I will come to that later in the story. But let me first put the year of my birth into a much wider context than myself. I was born in the autumn of 1949, on the cusp of what some believe to be a new epoch in the geological history of planet Earth, the epoch called the Anthropocene. Technically, this means the time when the activities of Homo sapiens will be discernible in the geological record millions of years from now. There's much debate, though, as to when this epoch should be counted as beginning. Some put it at the rise of agriculture and human settlements 8 to 10,000 years ago, others at the start of global exploration and trade about 400 years ago, and others at the start of the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago. But look at these graphs for a minute. The year at the dotted line is 1950. The year that some people say started the Great Acceleration. Now that phrase, to my mind, is rather uncomfortably sounds like Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, the Great Acceleration. Since 1950, and I've put up some arrows there for particular things, since 1950, human population has nearly trebled to 7 billion people. And these are some of the things that we have done. Urban population has skyrocketed. We have increased the use of primary energy, fertilizer, there's water somewhere, that is motor vehicles, this transport thing is motor vehicles. And international tourism has aided globalization. Here are some of the things that have happened to the planet during this time, since 1950. You can see that our climate is changing, our chemistry is changing, and the trends that you see here are the type and magnitude that will be noticed in the geological record millions of years from now. Now, these two in particular I want you to look at, the loss of tropical forests and the increase in land used for crops. This is for domesticated, means for crops and pasture. Now, if we now include cities and infrastructure in this graph, the more than 50% of the Earth's ice-free land surface has been modified by human beings. So including cities and infrastructure, it would go up to over 50%. Both of these trends are very bad news for biodiversity. Biodiversity, as you all know, is the great variety of living beings on the planet, but they are assembled at various levels, from ecosystems and habitats to species themselves, to the populations that make up those species, to the genes that make up the individuals. And loss of natural habitat, as we see here, is one form of biodiversity loss. Now this one is called terrestrial biosphere degradation, and it's measuring percent decrease in the abundance of plants and animals in terrestrial systems, and this particular one was modelled in 2010, so 6 years ago. A report in 2014 on vertebrates in both terrestrial and marine systems showed that global populations have declined by more than half. This is another type of biodiversity loss, the decline in a species numbers, the diminishing of its populations, and this can happen very rapidly, but really rather obscurely. Nobody really notices these crashes. But the type of biodiversity loss that most concerns me is that of the actual extinction of animal species, whole species. This happens rather slowly. The last few individuals of a species can persist over some time, but once they're gone, so it's very dramatic. Extinction itself is very dramatic. The rate of extinction of animals in the last 100 years has soared far beyond the background rate as observed in the fossil record. If present trends continue, 75% of all species, plant and animal, would be gone in the next few centuries. So many scientists believe that a mass extinction is underway, and this will be the sixth such mass extinction in the history of the planet Earth, the fifth one being the disappearance of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Now, arguably, the most dangerous aspect of the Anthropocene from the current human point of view is the loss of biodiversity. Whether we're talking about the loss of whole habitats, whole species, or changes in the extent or quality of habitats, or relative abundance of species, individuals in species, there'll be profound effects on the ecosystem functions on which our human species entirely relies. Now, we may or may not elevate our times to the status of epoch. If we do, we may dispute when it started, but clearly there's something very serious going on. Unlike the starting points of other geological epochs, which were caused by ice ages or supervolcanoes or meteorite impacts, the changes that we see at the boundary of this Anthropocene are caused by one species, that is ourselves. Amazingly, we do understand these changes. We understand what's going on. As an American journalist recently said, this is either deeply depressing or deeply hopeful, depending on what happens next. A previous tribal elder, Aubrey Manning, said, "Something has got to give in this perfect storm of global circumstances, rising from the numbers, increased demand on resources, and changing climate." Now, putting the circumstances of my birth into a somewhat narrower context, it was on the 7th of September, making me a Virgo. It was exactly like my grandmother and Elizabeth I, both of whom were born on the 7th of September. And the place was Memphis, Tennessee, where a 14-year-old Elvis Presley was living, not far from where I was born. Memphis still dozed on the banks of the mighty Mississippi River, mired in magnolias, mint juleps, and racial segregation of the Old South. And when I was 2 years old, I was given a bride doll, and that's me at 2 with my mother. I was given a bride doll with a little trunk for her clothes, and Mother rejoiced in telling the story that I kept a dead squirrel in the trunk. Then I had my first live animal at age 3. It was a small toad, for which my grandfather constructed a cage we called the frog box. With my old aunt in the garden of her antebellum home down in Mississippi, I made sunken terraria filled with plants, insects, woodlice, and snails. My childhood pets ranged widely throughout the animal kingdom. I had the usual dogs, budgies, and goldfish, but also I had guinea pigs, ducks, tortoises, caimans, newts, spiders, ants, earthworms, and a multitude of caterpillars so that I could watch their metamorphosis. My parents happily allowed all these, but for some inexplicable reason, my dear mother drew the line at snakes. Now, at age 6, I accidentally stepped on my Easter chick. You know how you get little chicks for Easter, and I killed it. It was a great tragedy. I was certainly distressed, but it was all lessened somewhat by my Sunday school class praying for the little chick. At age 9, however, I was told by my Bible teacher that animals don't have souls. It was devastating news to me, and that must have led me to think if God won't help the animals, then somebody else has to. Now, I was a very good student. I was on track to study biology at university, or as we said in America, major in biology. But in my first year, at age 18 in 1967, I was advised to sign up for an advanced biology course, but disaster struck in the very first day of class. My professor asked in a stentorious voice, "Have you ever dissected the head of a dogfish?" And I didn't even know what a dogfish was. That very day I changed track and I signed up to major in philosophy. Remember, this was the 60s, and highbrow thoughts were very much in the air, along with a lot of other stuff. The philosopher who inspired me most was the Frenchman Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was an early 20th century Jesuit priest whose work was condemned during his lifetime by the Catholic Church. His cosmic theology reconciled his religious faith with his studies in geology, biology, and Darwinian evolution. Now, at some point in the spring of 1970, I was watching a broadcast by the beloved American newsreader Walter Cronkite. And I really think watching this broadcast changed the course of my life. Cronkite had reported on all the major American events of the 1960s, the Kennedy and King assassinations, the manned space program, the Vietnam War, and he was known as the most trusted man in America. Now, he'd been profoundly moved by this photograph. It's called Earthrise. It's a picture of our planet as seen from space, taken on Christmas Eve, 1968, by an astronaut on the Apollo 8 mission. Cronkite strongly believed that humans have a sacred duty to protect the Earth, And yet every day he received news of the destruction of rainforests and the slaughter of wildlife. So he put together a series of reports called Can the World Be Saved? And he ran them alongside his CBS Evening News in early 1970. The broadcast that I was watching, Cronkite defined ecology, and it pulled together for me my original passion for animals and nature and the work of the philosopher who inspired me most. Cronkite went on to give the first Earth Day huge coverage on a major US television station. Earth Day was a celebration of the natural world and a call to arms to protect the environment. And Cronkite was like a prophet. He bemoaned the, as he called it, the littered earth and the filthy waters, and called the widespread desecration a crime against humanity. Many people believe this broadcast was instrumental not only in popularizing the environmental movement, but also in legitimizing environmental reform. Some even say it was the most important aspect of Cronkite's legacy. And yet the current entry in Wikipedia for Walter Cronkite does not even mention it. Earth Day is now celebrated in 192 countries by more than 1 billion people. And it's just as a sort of, as an aside, the date of the first Earth Day was originally chosen to maximize participation by American university students, but it coincided with the 100th birthday of Lenin. So some conservatives in the US thought it was all a communist trick. And I think a lot of them still do. Now, I finished my philosophy major, but I took extra courses in the sciences in my last year, enough to get me into graduate school in the Department of Zoology at Duke University. And it was there that I became fascinated by the lemurs of Madagascar because of the unique lemur research center at Duke. And there I had a part-time job feeding and cleaning the animals. Now, I'd become enamored of the little mouse lemurs. Not only were they cute and appealing, not that that should sway a serious zoologist, of course, but I actually discovered their hitherto unknown means of communication. They had a rich vocal repertoire in the ultrasonic range. That means human beings can't hear their noises. So I decided I would do my PhD research on mouse lemurs and figure out how they could stay in touch with each other in the dense forests that they inhabit. Because high-frequency sounds lose energy so rapidly when they travel through dense foliage. So I had to have some pretty sophisticated sound recording kit to do this study. I begged, borrowed, and bought it, paid for my passage to Madagascar with a little inheritance I'd received from my grandmother. And this was not nearly as intrepid as it might sound, because I went with my then boyfriend, who was also studying lemurs. Of course, I'd read a lot about Madagascar in preparation for my expedition, but the moment I set foot on what's called the Great Red Island, I was totally bewitched by it. The 88 million years of no connection to any mainland made it so that its animals and plants had evolved in some really astonishing directions. And to a young zoologist, of course, this was absolute paradise. This was just as well because shortly after my arrival in Madagascar, my fancy equipment succumbed to the heat and rain of the tropics, leaving me with a rather dilapidated but bulletproof recording system, which at least would cope with sounds audible to humans. But what a glorious symphony awaited me in the gallery forests of the south, where I ended up. I refocused my research on the whole noisy community, from insects to frogs, to birds to lemurs, and how that community dealt with the forest acoustics. So I was able to spend the next 18 months essentially studying the natural history of Madagascar. Now, a vital technique in so doing, of course, was to get as close to the animals as possible. So I surrounded myself with a wonderful menagerie. I had a little hawk, a little Madagascar kestrel, found a baby fruit bat I called Dorian, a most adorable creature. Many, many mouse lemurs. And my great pal was a red-collared lemur called Chico. And Chico actually I got a little female for him, but he preferred a chicken. And finally, I had a baby ringtail lemur who taught me what a bidet is for. Now, Madagascar was not an easy place to leave, not just because I'd fallen in love with it, but because of the various events, various things that happened to me, reminiscent of the perils of Pauline. Some of you recall the perils of Pauline. These included an attack on me in the forest one night for being an evil spirit. The roof of my hut was torn away in a cyclone, necessitating my moving in with some missionaries. There was a military coup, followed a week later by a presidential assassination, which was then followed by another coup, military coup, and this grounded all air travel to and from Madagascar for 6 months. Anyway, I finally made it back to my university, started to write up my dissertation while I was teaching introductory zoology. And one of my profs came to me one day and asked if I knew a writer called Gerald Durrell. And I said, no, him, I answered. I read his books in the mission library in Madagascar, and he is one of my heroes. So, less as a brainy graduate student and more as an exotic specimen who lived in the bush in a remote country, I was invited to dinner at my prof's house with several other professors and the great man himself. Jerry and I hit it off. We talked about animal communication. We talked about Madagascar, where he'd never been, by the way. And the role of zoos in conservation. A few months later, he invited me to hear him give a lecture in Washington, and then he invited me to visit him in Jersey, where he'd been planning to set up an animal sound recording laboratory at his Jersey zoo, and he wanted my advice. So I jumped at the chance. Now, when I arrived in Jersey, I was surprised to find that Gerald Durrell's zoo didn't actually cover the whole of the island, but instead it nestled on a lush 25 acres of idyllic countryside where breeding programs for some of the rarest species on Earth were being undertaken, field expeditions were being meticulously planned by zookeepers, and young gorillas played on the lawn of a 17th century manor house. I was equally surprised to find that the main objective of my visit was somewhat different from that I'd imagined. It was not to discuss the finer points of setting out a sound recording forest. Now, at this point, I won't say the rest is history because I need to relate the highlights of the next few decades, which are relevant to my talk tonight. And one of the greatest privileges I had was to work with Jerry on books, television programs, and radio programs. He had already hugely influenced the next generation of conservationists through his writings and his broadcasts. And I'm sure that Jerry's legacy as a communicator just cannot be overstated. One of the earliest projects together was to collaborate on this book, The Amateur Naturalist. Jerry wrote the purple prose, as he called it, and I did the research. And it was a whirlwind tour of the natural history of the major ecosystems of the world, with an emphasis on how they work through processes such as pollination and nutrient cycles. The functions that today are described by that buzz phrase, ecosystem services. We dedicated the book to two important people in our lives. He to Theodore Stephanides, whom you'll have all seen watching the Durrells on Sunday evening, and I to my grandfather who built that first frog box. The book was made into one of 4 television series we did together during the 80s. TV work was definitely not glamorous or action-packed, and the phrase "hurry up and wait" was perfectly descriptive. But it was usually great fun, and I just thought I'd put up a few snapshots of those days. And there's a little collage there. Let's see, so for the amateur naturalists, we studied ponds in England. We studied marsh habitat from horseback in the Camargue in France. And we studied termite ecology in South Africa. And this takes a little bit of explaining if you need standing those toilet rolls. And what you do is you place toilet rolls at different distances from a termite mound, and then over a few days you then look and see how deeply the termites have eaten into the the toilet rolls at different distances from the mound, and this gives you an idea of termite activity during different conditions, say climatic weather conditions and such. We also made a series called Ark on the Move, and it was about Madagascar and Mauritius, and there we are. This was a very amazing thing. This is the egg of a bird called, the elephant bird called Apionis, and it became extinct probably in the 1600s, so the egg was not fossilized or anything. It's just, you could find them occasionally in riverbeds. So that was a pretty extraordinary thing to do. Then we went to the Soviet Union. We were the first natural history film crew to work in the USSR during the Cold War. And we were introduced to a griffon vulture there, and were given on the last day of the shoot, we were given a mammoth tusk. You see that there, we were up in the tundra, and of course there was no way to get that home. So Jerry and I collaborated on 2 more books, me on the research, Jerry on the purple prose. But writing with Jerry was never a tedious prospect, because we could go at our own pace, and we worked down at our wonderful home in the south of France, near Nîmes, where Jerry would concoct these glorious meals, and I would tend my plants and look after various insects that I kept under screen cheese covers. But then came the time I had to write a book on my own, and it was called The State of the Ark. It was a snapshot of what was happening to the world's animals, plants, and ecosystems in the mid-1980s. Now, I was supposed to turn on the purple prose, but I discovered my best writing was when it was simple, clear, and concise, minus all jargon. The wisest thing said in the book was not by me, of course, but it was by Jerry, who wrote the foreword. And he said, "I'm delighted to see that my wife has expunged that awful phrase, the third world, from her text. There is only one world, and that belongs to all of us, and it's the only one we have." Now, the most important part of the 17 years I spent with Gerald Durrell revolved around the charitable trust that he established in 1963 to run his zoo and to carry out its mission to save species from extinction. Now, that is which is written here in stone. This is our mission stone, saving species from extinction. And to my mind, that's the most elegant mission statement I know. There are only 4 words needed to convey its essence, and they are simple, concise, and elegant. Our symbol is the dodo, the flightless bird from Mauritius that was driven to extinction by the activities of humans within 100 years of its discovery. Jerry turned his attention to Mauritius in the mid-70s because some of the species and habitats there were clearly going the way of the dodo. So much so that many conservationists said that they were lost causes. But that phrase, lost causes like third world, was a red rag to Jerry. And the work he started then and inspired then continues to this day, with dozens of species being saved or being saved, and the most famous of which, the biggest lost cause of all, was the Mauritius kestrel, which was down to 4 known individuals in the mid-1970s. And they now number 500 flying free individuals in Mauritius. We developed a conservation toolbox for species recovery and restoration. And that includes captive breeding, both in-country and outside the country concerned, field research, the translocation of captive bred or wild individuals to their natural habitats, intensive management of populations in the wild, restoration of habitats, professional training of conservation practitioners, community engagement and empowerment in education and conservation, and the establishment of protected areas. This is the whole of the toolbox. And since the mid-70s, we've operated field programs in dozens of countries for critically endangered species that have become flagships for their habitats and the local human communities who are slowly but surely gaining the knowledge and the skills to look after them. Our reach is extensive across species and regions, from amphibians to mammals, old world to new, islands to continents. Now, another of Jerry's dreams was to turn his zoo into a mini university for conservation. And he did this. We now call it the Dural Conservation Academy, It's right next door to the wildlife park in Jersey. Thousands of conservation practitioners from 2/3 of the countries of the world have received training. The Academy also runs outreach programs at different parts of the world, but including something we recently set up, which offers a postgraduate diploma in endangered species recovery, and that is based in Mauritius. Now, my biggest role at the Trust, while Jerry was still alive, was to head start our conservation program in Madagascar. So no big surprise there. Jerry wanted me to take the lead on this, and it all began in 1983 when we signed a formal agreement with the government of Madagascar to assist in conservation efforts. Our first big project was to try to save this species, the Ploughshare Tortoise, numbering only a few hundred individuals in a remote area in the northwest. Through the use of nearly all the tools in that conservation toolbox I mentioned, we made great strides towards its recovery. This very multifaceted approach unfolded over a period of about 15 years, during which time the local people nicknamed me Dadini Angunuki, and that is the grandmother of the tortoise, and that is what surely has earned me a place among the tribal elders. Now, since 1983, we've applied the Dural treatment to a number of other gravely threatened species in Madagascar, from fish to turtles to birds to mammals. The program has expanded to become our biggest field program in terms of staff, budget, and species. Well, Jerry passed away in 1995, and I assumed his mantle of honorary director of the Trust. And for a few years, I worked closely with senior management on every aspect of the Trust's activities, as well as overseeing the Madagascar program. But then in 2001, our director, Jeremy Mallinson, retired. Jeremy had been Jerry's right-hand man for 42 years. He'd been the best man at our wedding. And that made quite a difference. And so under a succession of chief executives thereafter, I became much more of a general ambassador and fundraiser. With this slight lessening of day-to-day duties, I tried my hand at something that I always wanted to do, but that Jerry would never let me do, and that is to learn to fly. So I got my license in Jersey, and then I went on to build hours in Florida, and I brought back with me my flying instructor, who happens to be Scottish, Colin Stevenson, who's with us tonight, and Colin has enthusiastically taken up the Dural cause. Well, we bought an aeroplane, and we began to fly animals from Jersey, between their breeding programs in Jersey, the UK, and Europe, flying animals for the Trust. And we made some amazing trips, like flying into Tempelhof, which was famous for the Berlin airlift just before it closed in 2008. We also went down to Majorca, and coming back we thought we'd had an engine failure. This was over the Pyrenees, not a good place to have an engine failure. But it was just the sound of a hornbill tapping loudly against the side of its travel crate. Anyway, I'm not flying much these days because somehow I've become more deeply involved in the Trust, just as Jerry asked me to many years ago. He loves shocking people by saying he was the only man in the world who'd ever been married for his zoo. But he was serious when he told them he'd wanted to marry a good widow. Now, we're a relatively small conservation organisation compared to WWF, for example, or indeed the RZSS. We have a staff of about 160 in Jersey and around the world, and our turnover is about £8 million. Jerry always said he wanted the Trust to be small but perfect. But the impact of our work is much bigger than our size suggests. Jerry would have been justifiably proud of this graph, which shows for all the species that we've worked with, for which we've had suitable data, the probability of their survival over time. So time is on the bottom axis, and the likelihood of survival on the vertical axis. And going up is good and going down is bad. And you can see the slope of the line with the little animals on it. Those are the species that we have been working with. Had we not intervened, and our scientists have done this thing they call the counterfactual line slopes down. So those species, had we not worked with them, would have been heading for extinction. Now, as Roger Wheater said, zoos will play an ever-increasing role in conservation. To put this into context, here's the same graph, or a similar graph anyway, for thousands of species grouped into their classes and assessed by the IUCN in their famous red data books. And you can see that none of those major groups are doing particularly well, and the poor old corals are really declining, really in trouble. Now, I'm going to superimpose the Dural line right there. And this demonstrates two things. First of all, we choose highly endangered species. In other words, we're starting very low on that vertical axis. Lost causes, some might call them, and yet their chances are improving. So it is possible to reverse the slide towards extinction. But is it possible to reverse, halt, or at least temper this sixth mass extinction that is probably upon us, or is this sixth extinction inevitable? Well, before I even attempt to answer such a question, let me hark back to the talks of previous tribal elders who comprised 3 professors, Jane Goodall, Aubrey Manning, Roger Wheater, and the Princes Royal. And I'm now reminded of a quote attributed to Sir Isaac Newton. "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." What have we seen from the shoulders of these giants? The tribal elders have all followed a common theme, and it's that of ecological connections. Aubrey reminded us that biodiversity is about the billions of interactions among the millions of species that make up functioning ecosystems. Her Royal Highness reminded us that each species is an essential part of nature's jigsaw of the ecological network, and that each has a role to play, however obscure, however modest the role. If you remove one species, another may step in, and the strength of the network remains. But remove several species and the connections start to weaken and disappear. The network itself is compromised, and there comes a tipping point at which it can no longer compensate for change. It's no longer resilient, and there's a cascade of extinctions and catastrophic collapse of the system. Roger reminded us of this when discussing how the removal of elephants in Uganda caused collapse of the grassland system and reversion to woodland. And Gerald Durrell expressed it in his inimitable purple prose when he said in 1972, "The world is as delicate and as complicated as a spider's web. Touch one strand and you send shudders running through all the other strands. But we're not just touching the web, we're tearing great holes in it." But species that make these connections in the web are themselves made up of populations, and the populations are made up of individuals. Thus, in theory, each individual can make a difference, as Jane said. She emphasized the positive difference, like the hands-on activities of her Roots and Shoots groups. But Aubrey reminded us of the negative impacts we can each make, for example, having too many children or clocking up food miles. The significance of individual actions becomes important when they occur in large numbers, when the impacts of individuals are combined into a single large force. When we hear about the positive impacts, they do seem to be on a smaller scale than the negative ones. So it's true that some are hugely impressive, like Jane's Roots and Shoots. They now have 150,000 members in 130 countries. Greenpeace has compelled the giant Nestle Corporation not to use palm oil. Fair trade persuades millions of consumers around the world to purchase socially and environmentally benign products. But all these good results still pale when compared to the far-reaching impacts of climate change, caused by billions of people and millions of businesses releasing carbon into the atmosphere, or the illegal trade in wild animals and plants, which touches every single country and is valued at $25 billion a year, making it the third most profitable international crime in the world after drugs and human trafficking. 54 years ago, Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, describing the ecological consequences of using pesticides. This book became hugely important, David Attenborough calling it the book that changed the scientific world the most, second only to Darwin's Origin of Species. In the last decade, there have been some equally extraordinary books like Eradicating Ecocide, Farmageddon. There have been films like End of the Line and An Inconvenient Truth, but somehow their impact appears to have been less than Carson's book. Have we heard about deforestation, climate change, and overfishing so often that we've become desensitized to the point we don't know how much we should care? Environmental improvements always seem to lag behind. Durrell once said that the destruction of nature proceeds at the speed of an exocet, whereas conservation of nature progresses like a donkey and cart. However, there are two important things to hold on to. First, the destruction of nature is generally not malicious or deliberate, but it happens because companies must maximize their profits or because people are poor and need food and money. Second, a concern for nature is found across cultures, professions, and classes. It's perhaps weaker in some groups and more profound in others, but because it crosses the usual barriers that set human beings apart from one another, I believe that concern for nature is a universal principle. Surely, if there is no malicious intent to destroy nature, and the concern for nature is ubiquitous, and nature is comprised of connections, then the force arising from the combined efforts of individuals can change things for the better. You'll all remember the quote attributed to Margaret Mead, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world." Now, I would like to recall the more personal lessons that I've learned since the dawn of the Anthropocene and hope that you might find them useful. So, first, don't hesitate to be inspired, whether by a photograph, a philosopher, a journalist, a hero, or a professor or a princess, or a fantasy like living in Madagascar or flying an airplane. Just explore thoroughly where that inspiration takes you. Second, understand that size isn't everything, but quality is. During my formative years, the legendary boxer Muhammad Ali said, "Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee." A statement I loved because it was so zoological, unintentionally I'm sure, but very apt here. And another legendary fighter, Durrell, said, "Be small but perfect." Third, understand that in the field of ecology and conservation, being a communicator is vitally important, because one must often convince people who normally listen only to human-related issues. To get and hold their attention, your language must be simple, clear, concise, and free of jargon. Finally, when the chips are down and you feel you can't see the way forward, don't give up. You may have to face equipment failure, cyclones, military coups, thieves and corruption, financial challenges and vested interests, and worst of all, severe last-ditch species endangerment. But be patient, keep thinking things through, gather your resources, and never believe a cause is lost until the cause itself has truly disappeared. As the father of modern conservation biology, Michael Soule, said, "There are no hopeless cases, only people without hope, and expensive cases." Now, this lesson has never more forcefully been brought home to me than right now. Regardless of our efforts of over 30 years to save the Ploughshare Tortoise, we're witnessing its extirpation by the illegal wildlife trade. Even the animals bred and released into the national park, which is protected by passionately devoted local communities, these animals are not immune because they become big business and they mean big money. $20,000 for an adult. And the poverty and corruption in Madagascar and the and all the way down the supply chain into China, which is the primary destination, simply fuel this trade. So this old grandmother could soon be bereft of her grandchildren. We're fighting back at many levels. We are stepping up our community programs, setting up watchtowers and armed patrols in the national park, working with senior government officials and the judiciary, training law enforcement and customs officers at the ports, and of course mounting armed guards at the breeding station in Madagascar, where the hundreds of ploughshares are worth millions of dollars. An expensive case indeed. Nobody ever said that conservation was a picnic, but the rewards are enormous, infinitely more important than most people can imagine. What is at stake is no less than life on Earth. Thank you very much.
I'm Jeremy Peake, Chairman of Trustees, and it's my great pleasure to take us through the rest of this evening. We'll come to thanks in a moment, but now is an opportunity to take 2 or 3 questions from people here, and I'm sure there are points that have come with you. It doesn't have to be about the Dural programme on the television, it can be about anything. So who'd like to ask the first question? Yes?
What do you see here yourself doing next?
Myself doing next?
Like, what do you want to do? In terms of conservation?
What do I want to do in terms of the really? I don't know, frankly, I just sort of keep going, you know what I mean? There's so many challenges out there. I think the illegal wildlife trade is a huge challenge. And no one institution can deal with it. We're just going to have to get together a lot more. I see certainly zoos getting, I'm hoping zoos get together a lot more and work together and collaborate, because again, you can't do it all by yourself. But I feel that sort of coming, and I hope I can be a part of that.
And what's the key to dealing with the illegal wildlife trade? It's something we all feel passionately about.
I know.
What's the key? Is it China?
I think the key is wherever the destination of the things that are being traded, and it is China and a lot in Southeast Asia, Middle East, I suppose. But the problem with that, Jerry, is that to change that is a couple of generations, 3 generations of education.
Yeah.
And we haven't got time, these species haven't got time for that, so there's going to have to be a lot of law enforcement. I mean, one of the biggest things in Madagascar, of course, is the corruption. And how do you fight that? And it is education and changing people. There's just not a lot of time, so I think we're going to lose lots of things through the illegal trade.
Is there an easier question?
Yes.
A topical question. People like the RZSS say that we shouldn't be shooting feral cats to protect the Scottish wildcat. That seems a bit... You'd think the RZSS would be supporting conservation, but it doesn't seem to be in this case. That was in this morning, I guess, in the paper.
Right.
The Zoological Society is getting a bit of bad press about that, but surely getting rid of feral cats is a good thing.
Well, am I on thin ice here? I would have to...
Let's hear what you think.
Okay, what I think is I would have to agree, because we ourselves are very much involved in all of our island conservation work, in ridding those islands of invasive species. And it's just something you have to do. I mean, nobody likes particularly killing cats. Nobody likes, killing donkeys in the Galapagos, or goats, or things like that. But we are involved in that sort of thing, and that's the only thing that can be done to restore some of these systems, or restore some sort of balance to these systems, and save a great number of endangered species, not just single species, but all the species in a system on an island. So I know that particular issues in Scotland, but I think you've got to do it.
Humanely.
Of course, yes, of course, humanely.
Rather than just indiscriminate shooting of beavers, which
Oh,
we're also seeing at the moment. Anyone else? Yes.
Nowadays with things like Facebook and Twitter, it's extremely easy to sign and share petitions. How valuable do you think that is? How much impact does it have? And also, what other things can we all do quite easily to make a difference?
Right. I think so. Social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all that, very, very powerful. I totally agree with that. Did you say not to mention the Durrells? So I started a Twitter account some time ago, never used it, you know. And then kind of geared up to being able to do some tweets during the series. And my followership, or whatever you call it, you know, just wow, went way up by hundreds. And nothing like Stephen Fry with 2.3 million. But yeah, so it's very, and it's, I guess one, you know, could be forgiven for asking, is it frivolous? And some of it is really frivolous. But the Twitter people, things that I'm signed up to, they're really interesting environmental things and various things going at universities and other zoos and such. So I think very, very powerful, and everybody should use them, you know, for good. Let's use them for good. And what was your second one? What did I think could be how they could be used?
No, just are there any other things that you can recommend people to do quite easily and simply to make a difference? Because a lot of people.
Oh gosh, there's yeah.
So I just wonder how I can make it have the biggest impact.
I think lifestyle is one thing. I mean, if everybody just have a good environmentally friendly lifestyle. Certainly, that's just the very first thing to do. I think very carefully about having children, and I know Aubrey said that in his thing, but I think that's absolutely true this day and age. It's a huge responsibility, so think about that. Go and support various groups that you think are doing a good job. You know, you can find out about groups these days and whether they're doing a good job or a bad job, and lend your support to those. And you know, become a conservationist. Go to, you know, join the groups.
Lovely advice. Yes, maybe.
Just interestingly, I went to a talk not long ago, and in Edinburgh, the forces of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution coincided during the period of the Enlightenment, 1776. These are massive forces. So much species loss and damage to the planet is consequential of the marriage of these two forces, if you like. And as you pointed out, there's probably no malicious intent, but we've created a market which demands what you're up against. And I wonder how you keep your spirits up sometimes.
How you keep your spirits up. Well, what did Jerry say? Jerry did say, he said, you know, I can't do anything else other than go on fighting for what I believe in, because you know, if you give up, then definitely the candle's lost. So, but you're right, great forces are sort of ranged against us, but you know, you do see some quite amazing things happen. You know, like the example of the Nestle, Greenpeace and the Nestle campaign. I mean, that happened. The whole acid rain. Does anybody remember acid rain? I don't think we have that anymore, because it was, you know, everybody sort of rallied about that. But as
you had acidifying oceans.
We say yes, we certainly yes, we have that. And that all has to do with the you know, everybody's carbon footprint and that kind of thing. So as I say, every individual's got to do their little bit, and then but get together in these small groups that Margaret Mead talked about and try to change the world. You know, you've got to.
The last question. Yes, John.
What are your views on reintroduction of species that have become extinct?
Difficult.
That's do you think that have become extinct in the wild that or bred them in captivity? Yeah, I think.
Like in Scotland, beaver, lynx,
wolves, yeah. Yeah, I think it's got to be tried. I think the whole notion of rewilding I mean, there are many different concepts of rewilding, and so many issues need to be dealt with and understood, which are not understood. We do, though, a lot of reintroductions, but we're working on island systems which are very self-contained. We can control the issues, but I think our work, it's research as well. We publish it, and it's can be used, can be applied in other contexts. But I think, yes, of course we've got to do that. I think it's a great idea.
Okay, well, it really is very difficult to sum up how much you've said to us this evening. It was a remarkable combination of your life story with what you and Jerry have achieved over these years. I've had the pleasure of speaking with Lee during the course of the day, and I'm delighted that RZSS is associated in some way with Jersey, and I hope we can further the links, because I think we share objectives and we've got so much we can learn from Jersey, and I hope we can continue to work together. But that was a truly remarkable lecture, for which we are all immensely grateful. So let's just, not for the last time, but let's thank him. We have put together a little photograph.
Oh, that's gorgeous.
That's from our photographer in residence, and the ringtail lemurs.
Can everybody see that?
Yeah, we hold it up high. And that's Laurie Campbell, who sadly can't be with us today. But now, every time I come through the members' gate and up to the Mansion House, I stop and look at the ringtails. I think they're wonderful. So that's that.
Lovely.
For you to take away, but now I have to take something away from you.
I know.
This is going to be different. So what we're giving you, this is a sort of substitute of sorts. This is actually a beaver stick. This comes from Knapdale, and it has been chewed by reintroduced Scottish beavers. So it may not be quite the same, but that's the best we can offer.
Love that, Jeremy. Thank you so very much for that.
It was the only way we could think of getting this away from you.
It's either the wisdom of the beaver or the grandmother of the beaver.
Yeah, the beavers are there, and I hope they're going to be there
yes,
for many generations.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
Now,
Thank you.
the next thing I have to say is our next lecture, which is by David Jonah Weston, who's the chairman of the African Conservation Centre in Nairobi. And Chris knows him well, I'm sure Lee knows him well, and he's a remarkable man, and he's going to be talking about conserving the wealth and life and health of our planet requires making a break with our evolutionary past and changing our own nature. I think you would agree with that, what we're saying. So that's going to be on the 13th of October. So we really look forward to it, and I just also want to say my own thanks to Kathy for all that she's done in setting this up, and indeed for the residencies, and wish her well for an early recovery. I also want to say for another first time, just Chris has not got many appearances left, so thanks for everything, Chris, but we've got you for a while yet. And that basically is where we come to the end. It's been marvellous to see so many people here. We are making a retiring collection, the proceeds of which will be shared between Dural and RZSS to continue our conservation work. And I think this series is going from strength to strength. It's great to have two of our elders here, previous elders, and we keep in touch with them. It's great we've got a marvellous sixth speaker to come. So I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank the organisers, Kathy, and the others, Jude and Claire and the others who've done so much hard work in setting this up. And I want to once more ask you to thank our magnificent speaker, Lee Durrell.